The Sea of Japan is a closed body of water in the strategic sense, bounded by the Korean peninsula to the west, the Japanese archipelago to the east, and Russia's maritime province to the north, with a southern exit through the Korea Strait that is itself one of the most monitored maritime choke points in the Pacific. Every vessel of consequence that operates in this sea operates under the continuous observation of at least 3 separate national intelligence architectures simultaneously. The Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces network of fixed hydrophone arrays, surface radar stations, and patrol aircraft covers the eastern approaches with a density of collection that leaves almost nothing undetected. The Republic of Korea Navy monitors the western approaches from a network of installations whose sensor ranges overlap across the central corridor. And the United States maintains its own persistent coverage through a combination of space-based assets, P-8 maritime patrol aircraft operating from Kadena and Misawa, and the organic sensor suites of whatever surface combatants are operating in the area at any given time. In the Sea of Japan, there is no such thing as an unobserved maneuver. This did not prevent the Korean People's Army from attempting one. The civilian evacuation had been ordered at 11:30 p.m. the previous evening, when the combination of a magnitude 6.4 earthquake centered 40 kilometers offshore of the South Korean port city of Pohang and the subsequent tsunami warning issued by the Korea Meteorological Administration for the entire southeastern coastline had created a coastal emergency affecting approximately 340,000 residents in the low-lying districts between Pohang and Ulsan. The ROK government had activated its National Emergency Response Framework within 19 minutes of the earthquake and had requested U.S. military assistance through the Combined Forces Command Operations Center in Seoul at 11:58 p.m. The request was specific: U.S. Navy amphibious and surface assets capable of providing evacuation lift and medical support for the coastal civilian population, while the road network in the affected area remained compromised by the earthquake's infrastructure damage. The USS Guided Missile Cruiser had been operating 140 nautical miles southeast of Pohang on a routine patrol when the emergency request reached Fifth Fleet. Its reorientation toward the evacuation operating area was ordered at 12:31 a.m. and it had been transiting northwest at 28 knots since 12:34 a.m., its medical spaces being prepared by the ship's surgeon and medical team, its small boat handling crews briefed on evacuation support procedures, and its communication suite configured to coordinate with ROK Coast Guard and JMSDF units that were simultaneously repositioning toward the affected coastline. It was this transit, a warship moving at 28 knots through the central corridor of the Sea of Japan in the early hours of the morning on a bearing toward a humanitarian emergency, that the Korean People's Army Navy's West Sea Patrol Command observed developing on its surveillance systems and made a decision about. At 2:08 a.m., the KPA Navy patrol vessel departed the port facility at Wonsan on the east coast of the Korean peninsula on a southwest heading at 31 knots. Its radar profile classified within 6 minutes by the cruiser's own sensors as a Soju-class coastal patrol vessel, a vessel whose weapons loadout included deck-mounted anti-ship torpedo tubes, a forward gun mount, and a command and communications suite that the KPA Navy uses for both patrol and harassment operations in the maritime approaches to the Korean peninsula. The contact was designated Track November 1. The cruiser's commanding officer had the contact on his personal plot within 8 minutes of its appearance. He reviewed the geometry with the specific attention of someone who has been maneuvering a large warship at high speed toward a humanitarian emergency, and has just been informed that a KPA Navy vessel has departed its home port on a heading that places it on a direct intercept course with his own projected track inside 40 minutes. The geometry was unambiguous. Track November 1 was not on a routine patrol heading. It was on an intercept heading, a course that, projected forward at its current speed relative to the cruiser's northwest transit vector, would bring both vessels to the same geographic position at approximately the same time. The commanding officer did not reduce speed. Reducing speed on a humanitarian transit because a KPA patrol vessel had emerged from Wonsan would have been a decision with 2 simultaneous consequences. It would have delayed the arrival of emergency medical and evacuation support to a coastal population in acute distress, and it would have confirmed to the KPA Navy that the emergence of a patrol vessel from any port on the Korean east coast was sufficient to alter the operational behavior of a U.S. Navy warship. Both consequences were unacceptable. The commanding officer maintained 28 knots. At 2:14 a.m., a second contact appeared. Bearing 298 degrees, range 44 nautical miles. Speed 28 knots. Classification: Osa-II-class missile boat departing from the KPA Navy facility at Myang Island on a south-southwest heading. The Osa-II carried 4 P-15 Termit anti-ship missiles in above-deck launchers, a weapons loadout that placed the cruiser inside theoretical engagement range at the moment the missile boat reached its current projected intercept position. Track November 2. 2 contacts, both departing KPA Navy facilities simultaneously, both on headings that converged on the cruiser's transit track within different time windows. The coordination of the departures, logged at 2:08 a.m. and 2:09 a.m. by the cruiser's electronic warfare suite through the KPA communications traffic that accompanied both vessel movements, was not coincidental. The KPA Navy West Coast Patrol Command had been monitoring the cruiser's humanitarian transit and had made a decision to intercept it, using a 2-vessel approach that brought a harassment asset from the north and an armed missile platform from the northwest on different approach vectors and different timelines. The commanding officer transmitted the contact picture to Combined Forces Command Operations Center at 2:16 a.m. and requested guidance on rules of engagement applicability for KPA Navy intercept operations during a declared humanitarian emergency transit. The response came back at 2:21 a.m. The rules of engagement applicable to KPA Navy interactions in international waters remained in effect without modification, regardless of the nature of the U.S. vessel's current mission tasking. An armed KPA Navy vessel conducting an intercept approach in international waters was subject to the same rules as in any other operational context. The commanding officer acknowledged and continued northwest. At 2:19 a.m., the communications officer began transmitting on the International Distress and Maritime Safety frequencies. The transmission identified the cruiser by type and current mission status, Humanitarian Emergency Response Transit to the Pohang coastal area, declared its heading and speed, and requested all vessels in the operating area to maintain safe navigation distances and clear the transit corridor. The transmission was made in English, Korean, and Russian, covering the 3 languages associated with the naval operating environments in the Sea of Japan. It was transmitted continuously at 5-minute intervals from 2:19 a.m. until the tactical situation resolved. Track November 1 did not respond on any frequency. Track November 2 did not respond on any frequency. At 2:27 a.m., Track November 1 had closed to 19 nautical miles, and its heading placed it on a course that would cross the cruiser's track approximately 4 nautical miles ahead of the cruiser's current position at the current relative speeds. The geometry was not a collision approach in the strict mathematical sense. It was a crossing approach, designed to bring the Soju vessel across the cruiser's bow at a range that constituted a deliberate denial of sea room rather than a direct impact vector. The intent was not to be hit. The intent was to be in the way, to occupy the space through which the cruiser was transiting, and to force the cruiser to maneuver around it, to slow, to deviate, to demonstrate in some measurable, observable, sensor-documentable way that the KPA Navy's physical presence in the transit corridor had produced a change in the American vessel's behavior. The commanding officer understood the geometry and its intent with the same clarity he had been applying to every tactical variable in the picture since 2:08 a.m. He directed the electronic warfare officer to activate the AN/SLQ-32 in targeted communications degradation mode against Track November 1's radio link with the Wonsan control station. The activation was narrow band and attributed, designed to be identified as coming from the cruiser, designed to communicate that the cruiser had the technical capability to degrade November 1's command and coordination architecture and was choosing to apply that capability now rather than later. The KPA patrol vessel's communications traffic to Wonsan dropped to intermittent quality within 14 seconds of the jamming activation. At 2:29 a.m., the MH-60R Seahawk helicopter that had been airborne on a standard patrol orbit since 1:40 a.m. received new tasking. The crew descended from 2,200 feet to 350 feet above the surface and moved to a position directly ahead of track November 1's bow at a range of 3.1 nautical miles from the KPA vessel, placing the helicopter in a low-altitude forward interposition that communicated physical presence in the approach corridor without constituting a weapons employment. At 350 feet above the water, the Seahawk's rotor wash created a visible circle of disturbed sea surface directly ahead of the approaching vessel. Its navigation lights were visible from the KPA patrol vessel's bridge at that range. Its own sensor suite was recording everything the vessel's deck and superstructure presented to a close-range aerial observer. Track November 1 did not reduce speed. At 2:32 a.m., the Seahawk crew reported a visual on November 1 at 2.4 nautical miles. Deck crew visible in what the pilot characterized as weapons-ready positions around the forward gun mount, the vessel driving hard into the slight swell at its maximum sustainable speed, its bow throwing a significant white water plume that was visible on the FLIR as a bright thermal signature against the cooler sea surface. The KPA vessel was committed. The closest point of approach calculation for track. November 1 across the cruiser's bow read 2.8 nautical miles at 2:33 a.m. Then 2.1 nautical miles as the geometry continued to develop. The cruiser's navigator reported the numbers in the flat declarative cadence of someone who has received clear instructions about his role in a tactical situation and is fulfilling that role with complete professional focus regardless of the numbers he is reporting. At 2:34 a.m., the cruiser's forward SPQ-9B target acquisition radar activated its fire control mode and locked onto track November 1. The activation produced a fire control radar signal that the KPA vessel's own electronic warfare receivers registered within seconds, a signal that told the vessel's crew, in the electronic language of weapons systems, that a targeting solution existed for their hull and was being maintained. Not a weapons employment. A declared solution. The distance between a declared solution and its application was a command decision, and the command had not authorized the application. But the declaration itself was a message in a frequency band that every naval officer who has served in the Sea of Japan understands with the precision of their training. Track November 1 began its turn at 2:34:41 a.m. Not a sharp emergency brake, a sustained high-speed turn to port that brought the bow of the Soju vessel 30 degrees off its previous heading within the first 15 seconds, then 55 degrees, then a committed full turn that placed the KPA vessel on a northeast heading pointing back toward the Wonsan approaches. The turn was executed at speed, the vessel heeling into it at an angle that was visible from the Seahawk's overhead position as a significant roll, the deck tilting toward the water on the outside of the turn, as the hull responded to the centrifugal force of a high-speed directional change in a vessel not designed for carrier operations. The crew on the forward deck had to brace against the motion. The KPA vessel was withdrawing fast. The CPA counter, which had been reading 1.6 nautical miles and falling at the moment of the turn, froze at 1.6 nautical miles and began to climb as November 1's new heading increased its separation from the cruiser's track. Track November 2 presented a different calculation. The Osa-II missile boat had been closing from the northwest on a bearing that would not have brought it into the cruiser's immediate path. Its geometry was designed to achieve a flanking position rather than a crossing position, placing it off the cruiser's port beam within range of its P-15 missiles as the cruiser passed the November 1 crossing point. With November 1 now withdrawing, November 2's tactical rationale had changed. It was no longer a supporting element in a two-vector harassment approach. It was a lone armed vessel with P-15 missiles in its launchers, closing the range to an American cruiser that had just activated its fire control radar against the lead element of the two-vessel formation. At 2:36 a.m., the Osa-II's own radar activated, a short-range surface search emission consistent with target acquisition mode rather than navigation mode. The electronic warfare suite logged the activation and classified it within 11 seconds, the square tie radar associated with the P-15 missile system's terminal guidance chain. November 2 was not navigating. It was acquiring. The tactical action officer requested engagement authority guidance at 2:36:14 a.m. The commanding officer authorized the Standard Missile Battery to engagement ready status at 2:36:19 a.m. Solutions maintained, authority not yet delegated to fire, but the full chain required to execute an engagement, if the authority was further delegated, was complete and ready. He also directed the electronic warfare officer to shift the jamming from November 1's communications link to November 2's square-tie radar frequency. The jamming was immediate and targeted, a high-power emission focused on the specific frequency the Osa-II's targeting radar was using, designed to degrade the radar's ability to refine a missile launch solution against the cruiser's hull. The square-tie emission from November 2 degraded in power within 8 seconds of the jamming activation. 30 seconds later, it shifted frequency. The electronic warfare officer followed within 12 seconds. The Seahawk crew received new tasking at 2:37 a.m. The helicopter repositioned from its overhead position on November 1's withdrawal track to a direct approach on November 2, descending to 280 feet and establishing a position 1.8 nautical miles off the Osa-II's port bow. The laser designator activated at 2:37:44 a.m., locking onto the missile boat's launcher deck and bridge structure simultaneously. At 280 feet and 1.8 nautical miles, the helicopter's presence was physically inescapable. Its laser was invisible to the KPA crew below it. Its meaning was not. November 2's square-tie radar shut down at 2:38 and 1 second a.m. 17 seconds after the laser designator established its solution. The Osa-II reduced speed to 14 knots at 2:38 and 12 seconds a.m. and began a gradual turn to the northwest. Not the committed high-speed withdrawal that November 1 had executed, a slower, more deliberate course change that brought the missile boat onto a heading that opened its range from the cruiser without the urgency of a vessel that had been frightened into retreat. The KPA missile boat's commanding officer was managing his withdrawal to maintain the appearance of a vessel choosing to alter its course rather than a vessel that had been compelled to. The commanding officer noted the distinction and logged it without further commentary. The tactical outcome was the same, regardless of the presentation. By 2:41 a.m., both KPA contacts were on headings that increased their separation from the cruiser at measurable rates. November 1 was already 9.4 nautical miles northeast and accelerating toward the Wonsan approaches. November 2 was 7.1 nautical miles northwest and continuing its gradual withdrawal. The transit corridor ahead of the cruiser was clear. The commanding officer directed no course change. The cruiser maintained its northwest transit, heading toward the Pohang coastal area at 28 knots. At 3:17 a.m., the cruiser entered the Maritime Coordination Zone, established by the ROK Coast Guard for the Pohang evacuation operation, and began coordinating with the Civilian Emergency Response Network. Its medical team received its first patient transfer, a 71-year-old man with a cardiac condition exacerbated by the evacuation, at 3:44 a.m. The ship's small boats were in the water by 4:02 a.m., supporting the transfer of civilian evacuees from a compromised pier structure that the earthquake had rendered unusable for the commercial ferry vessels that would normally have handled the load. Over the following 9 hours, the cruiser's small boat teams conducted 47 evacuation lifts, transported 312 civilians to the vessel's medical and temporary accommodation spaces, and coordinated with 2 ROK Navy landing ships and a JMSDF destroyer that arrived to support the operation at 6:30 a.m. and 8:14 a.m. respectively. None of the 312 civilians aboard the cruiser during the evacuation operation were aware that the ship carrying them had spent 33 minutes of its transit to their location managing a 2-vessel KPA Navy intercept approach in international waters before the tactical situation resolved and the humanitarian mission resumed without interruption. The engagement report that the commanding officer transmitted to 5th Fleet and Combined Forces Command at 11:30 a.m. documented both elements of the preceding 9 hours with equal precision, the KPA intercept operation and its resolution, and the humanitarian support activities that had proceeded without interruption following that resolution. The report did not treat the two elements as separate events because they were not separate events. They were sequential phases of a single operational period whose coherence depended on the tactical phase being managed correctly so the humanitarian phase could proceed on schedule. The KPA Intercept. Track, November 1. Soju-class patrol vessel, closest approach of 1.6 nautical miles. Fire control radar activation prompting withdrawal. Track, November 2. Osa-II missile boat, square tie targeting radar activation, degraded by electronic warfare, jamming across 2 frequency shifts, laser designation prompting radar shutdown and speed reduction. Total duration of KPA intercept management, 33 minutes from initial contact to confirmed withdrawal of both tracks. 0 weapons fired. 0 course deviations from planned humanitarian transit heading. The humanitarian operation, 312 civilians evacuated. Medical support rendered to 47 individuals requiring treatment beyond first aid. Small boat operations sustained for 9 hours across 47 individual lifts. Coordination maintained with ROK Coast Guard, ROK Navy, and JMSDF throughout. The costs of the intercept management were negligible in material terms. 2 electronic warfare jamming activations consuming power plant output and calibration reserves, a Seahawk crew extending their sortie to 4 hours and 19 minutes, a standard missile battery held in engagement-ready status for 11 minutes, no munitions expended, no damage sustained. The cost that does not appear in the material accounting was the 33 minutes during which the crew of a ship transiting to a humanitarian emergency had to simultaneously manage a KPA Navy intercept while maintaining their preparations and coordination for the medical and evacuation support mission waiting for them on the other side of the tactical situation. The medical team preparing the trauma bays below decks during those 33 minutes knew the ship was engaged in a surface confrontation above them because they could feel the differences in the ship's motion as the commanding officer made his adjustments. They continued preparing the trauma bays. The people who needed the evacuation support did not wait 33 minutes longer because of the KPA intercept. The humanitarian transit reached its destination on schedule because the commanding officer held his heading through the intercept geometry rather than deviating from it, and because the tools available to him, a fire control radar, a jamming system, a helicopter crew with a laser designator, and the sustained composure of a watch team that understood what was required of them, were sufficient to produce the tactical resolution without the escalation that would have consumed the time the humanitarian mission could not afford to lose. 2 KPA contacts. 33 minutes. 1 fire control radar activation that ended at 2:34:41 a.m. 1 missile targeting radar degraded across 2 jamming cycles and shut down at 2:38 and 1 seconds a.m. 1 laser designation that held its solution for 6 minutes and 41 seconds. 0 course deviations. 312 people evacuated from a compromised coastline who arrived aboard a warship that had already been a different kind of ship for the 33 minutes before it became theirs. The sea does not ask whether the vessel crossing it has been tested before it arrives at the task that needed it. It presents both conditions simultaneously and records which vessels held their heading through both. This one held. The record says so. And the 312 people who were carried to safety are themselves the most complete annotation of what holding that heading was worth.